Welcome back to our studios here in Lahore. I'm Hamza Amjad. Now, Pakistan's Prime Minister Omar Khan says the Kashmir issue is a humanitarian problem. Addressing a public gathering in Muzaffarabad, the Prime Minister said India is following a Nazi ideology to suppress Muslims in occupied Kashmir. Khan said India has besieged millions of Kashmiris by deploying nearly 1 million troops in the occupied valley. He said Indian actions in occupied Kashmir have internationalized the issue. The Prime Minister added that the United Nations Security Council took up the Kashmir issue after 50 years. He said the international community has asked India to lift the curfew. Khan said Pakistan is a peace-loving nation but will give a befitting response to any Indian misadventure. He pledged to effectively raise the issue at the United Nations General Assembly later this month. Pakistan has called on the United Nations Security Council to push India to end the occupied Kashmir lockdown. Pakistan's permanent ambassador to the UN, Dr. Maliha Lodhi, says the Security Council has failed to implement its resolutions on Kashmir. Speaking in the General Assembly, she said the bloodbath in Indian-occupied Kashmir has gone unchecked for over 70 years. Ambassador Lodhi said over 95,000 Kashmiris have lost their lives to brutal atrocities. She said Pakistan seeks a council that is democratic, effective and accountable to member states. A U.S. Congressional House panel has issued a subpoena to Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, demanding an explanation for the failure of U.S. Taliban talks. Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Elliot Engel says Khalilzad will appear before the House panel on September the 19th. Meanwhile, in a televised interview, Taliban spokesperson Sohail Shaheen said the group had concluded the peace accord with the U.S. He said if the Americans withdraw from the deal, a safe exit of U.S. troops from Afghanistan cannot be guaranteed. Now, peace talks between the United States and the Taliban began last October in Qatar. The discussions were held to end nearly 2 decades of war in Afghanistan. U.S. President Donald Trump says he will consider an interim trade deal with China until a permanent pact can be reached. The president's remarks come as the world's 2 largest economies prepare for a new round of talks to resolve their trade war. Washington and Beijing have made moves to build confidence ahead of the dialogue. China has renewed purchases of U.S. farm goods and excluded some American goods from retaliatory tariffs. President Donald Trump has reciprocated by delaying a tariff hike on Chinese goods by 2 weeks. But Trump says he would prefer to finalize a full-fledged agreement with Beijing.
I see a lot of analysts are saying an interim deal, meaning we'll do pieces of it, the easy ones first. But there's no easy or hard. There's a deal or there's not a deal.
Now, in New Zealand, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has tabled a new bill in Parliament to further tighten the country's gun laws. Now, the bill marks 6 months since the terrorist attacks on 2 mosques in Christchurch, which killed 51 Muslims. This is New Zealand's second set of gun reforms after the government identified weak weapon laws as a key reason behind the atrocity. The bill includes the creation of a registry to monitor and track every firearm legally held in New Zealand. It also tightens rules on licensing, binding individuals to renew their license every 5 years instead of 10. Earlier, Prime Minister Ardern said the government took action to remove semi-automatic weapons, and now it moves a step further.
Today, the government has also introduced legislation into the House that will help ensure gun ownership is restricted to responsible users and stop the flow of guns into the black market.
The European Union's incoming Trade Commissioner Phil Hogan says he sees cause for some optimism on Brexit talks. He says recent events in the UK Parliament have improved the likelihood of a further Brexit extension. Hogan says there can still be a sensible outcome to the Brexit situation. Expressing solidarity with the Republic of Ireland, he urged the UK to find a workable solution to the border backstop issue. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Boris Johnson will meet European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker on Monday. Johnson's office says he will seek to renegotiate the Brexit deal with Juncker during their meeting in Luxembourg. The Speaker of Britain's Parliament, John Bercow, has pledged to stop a no-deal Brexit. Bercow says he will use procedural creativity if the government tries to bulldoze a no-deal through the House of Commons. Delivering a lecture in London, Bercow said he would not be bound by any time limit or existing rules. He said the only possible Brexit is one explicitly endorsed by MPs. He said the law passed before Parliament's prorogation requires the government to seek a delay in Brexit until January the 31st. The delay will stay in place unless Parliament approves a Brexit deal by October the 19th. But Johnson said he would prefer being dead in a ditch than to ask the EU for another delay. The United Nations Refugee Agency has expressed regret at the impact a US Supreme Court ruling will have on people fleeing war and persecution. The top US court yesterday approved an application by President Donald Trump to curtail asylum applications at the border with Mexico. Now, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees spokesman Andrej Mahecic says all people must be allowed access to full asylum procedures and international protection. Addressing journalists in Geneva, Mahecic voiced concern for displaced Central American families who are in need of a safe haven. Italy has reached a deal with several EU countries to take in migrants aboard a charity ship in the Mediterranean. The Ocean Viking is carrying 82 Africans rescued in various operations off the coast of Libya. 17 minors are among the migrants on the French rescue vessel. This is run by the NGOs SOS Mediterranean and Doctors Without Borders. Earlier, a pregnant woman and her husband were rescued from the ship and taken to Malta due to a medical emergency. The rescue ship is currently stranded at sea between Malta and the Italian island of Lampedusa as Rome considers its request for a safe port. The new Italian government has promised to change its response to the migrant influx following the departure of hardline Interior Minister Matteo Salvini. Ukraine says it is planning a roadmap to implement a peace deal with Russia aimed at ending the Donbass conflict. President Volodymyr Zelensky said he will discuss the plan at the Normandy talks with Russian, German and French leaders. Zelensky said he expects to meet US President Donald Trump at the peace talks. Ukraine has been fighting Russian-backed forces in the eastern Donbass region for the past 5 years. Now, despite a ceasefire after the Minsk Agreement of 2015, the conflict has killed more than 13,000 people. Earlier, Russia and Ukraine completed a prisoner swap, serving as the first step to ease bilateral tensions ahead of the talks. Russia says it believes the war in Syria is over. In an interview, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the war is now confined to 2 areas not controlled by the government. Lavrov said Russia is now focused on organizing humanitarian assistance for Syrians. He said Moscow is working to establish a political process to stabilize Syria and the rest of the Middle East. Lavrov said US and EU sanctions against the Syrian government are counterproductive. Now, President Vladimir Putin said that Russia will continue to support the the Syrian government against rebels. Meanwhile, the New York Times has reported that the Pentagon is preparing to deploy 150 troops to northeast Syria. The US troops would conduct joint ground patrols with the Turkish forces in a safe zone established to prevent a Turkish military incursion. The UN has warned that some 2 million people in Somalia are at risk of starving. The country is currently facing its worst drought since 2011. The UN's relief chief, Mark Lowcock, says decades of conflict and a lack of investment has exacerbated the crisis. Speaking at the end of a 2-day visit, Lowcock said droughts have become more frequent. He said erratic rains have triggered recurring floods in the country. The UN's recent food security analysis shows the April to June harvest was the worst since 2011. Some 2.6 million people have already been displaced as a result of natural disasters. In southwest Somalia, almost 400,000 people have fled drought, terror attacks and armed conflict in the past 3 years. Now in Brazil, a fire at a hospital killed 10 people in Rio de Janeiro. The city's fire service says 90 patients were transferred to other hospitals. 4 firefighters were also injured while trying to douse the fire. An investigation is underway into the cause. Eleven people have been killed after a boat capsized during a religious ceremony in the central Indian state of Bhopal. Around 20 people had set out in a boat to immerse a huge worshipping idol in a lake near Katalapura Ghat. Police say 5 others have been rescued while a search for survivors is underway. Madhya Pradesh State's Chief Minister Kamal Nath has ordered a high-level inquiry into the accident. And with that, let's take a short break, but don't go anywhere, more stories to follow. Welcome back. Now, a new storm has brought rain and winds to the battered Bahamas, still reeling from the Category 5 Hurricane Dorian. The National Hurricane Center says it could become a tropical storm. It says the weather system is likely to pick up speed as it moves northwest and probably hitting Florida on Saturday. But the tropical cyclone is not expected to bring anything like the same level of devastation as Hurricane Dorian. With 1,300 people still missing, the Bahamian government is focusing on search and rescue operations. Earlier this month, Hurricane Dorian slammed into the Bahamas as a Category 5 storm, laying waste to population centers. Scientists are warning the biggest glacier in the Swiss Alps could melt away by the end of this century if global warming continues. Cutting-edge simulation technology shows how the almighty Aletsch Glacier will change the planet as temperatures rise. The glacier weighs in at 11 billion tons and covers 86 square kilometers of the Swiss Alps. Its tongue has already retreated by a kilometer since the turn of the century. Scientists predict the trend will continue even if the world can meet the 2015 Paris Agreement. In August, Iceland paid tribute to its vanished octuple ice sheet to bring the climate calamity to the world's attention. Climate change group Extinction Rebellion have announced mass demonstrations in London from the 7th of October. The group says it will shut down the major roads near Britain's Parliament in Westminster. It said it will shut down London to force the government to act now on the climate and ecological emergency. Earlier, police arrested 2 of the group's activists at Heathrow Airport. Airport authorities say they attempted to bring the airport to a standstill by flying drones nearby. Well, events are underway across China to celebrate the Mid-Autumn Festival, which falls on Friday this year. In East China's Zhejiang province, people are taking part in Lianhua performances, also called firewalking. Performers walk barefoot across burning coals, and the fire is used to ward off evil spirits and pray for good fortune. In Wanzai, locals enjoy folk activities as they celebrate the festival. Colorful lanterns, tasty food, firework displays, and traditional opera leave a deep impression on tourists. Now, diving deep in rivers, seas and oceans is a task that requires an enormous amount of strength of mind and body, kind of like this job. Freedivers from all over the world are proving the point in France, where they have gathered to dive below 100 meters in the French Riviera. Take a look.
Free divers from all over the world are exploring the depths of the Mediterranean Sea in this year's AIDA Depth World Championship. Russian free diver Alexei Malkinov descended to a depth of 118 meters in more than 4 minutes without taking a breath. The 8-time champion Malkinov also holds the constant weight free diving world record of 130 meters.
Well, today it was much warmer, so it felt great. I've had a good warm-up, and the dive was amazing. Like, it was very relaxing, very confident.
Divers can compete in different disciplines in the 2-week championship. Free divers must not only master breath-holding techniques, but also equalization, relaxation, and how to use the body's weight for propulsion.
We're really focused so we no longer feel what happens around us. It's about execution, a process that we work on for months. So we are really into the execution, immersed between ourselves and what we are doing.
The competition is being held from September 2nd to 15th on a 400 square meter offshore platform.
Now, first up in business, US internet giant Google has agreed to pay a $1 billion settlement to end a tax dispute with France. The payment comprises a fine of $503 million, plus additional taxes of $514 million. The fiscal fraud probe that began 4 years ago investigated Google's non-payment of dues to France. Investigators claimed that the tech giant avoided tax by not declaring parts of its activities. The payment follows similar out-of-court settlements by Google in Italy and Britain over recent years. Google says it now wants to see a coordinated reform for a clear international taxation framework. French Justice Minister Nicole Belloubet and Budget Minister Gérald Darmanin have welcomed the arrangement. European stock markets have opened steady as investors await a US central bank decision on interest rates next week. Bourses in London, Frankfurt and Paris are fractionally higher after the European Central Bank unveiled economic stimulus measures yesterday. Asian stock markets closed higher on optimism about forthcoming trade talks between the US and China. Tokyo's Nikkei 225 index and the Hang Seng index in Hong Kong gained about 1% to hit a 6-month high. Sydney's ASX 200 index was marginally higher, and stock markets in China and South Korea are closed for a holiday. Well, it's 34 degrees Celsius here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. And that was all I have from the news bulletin at the moment. Do stay tuned to Indus News for further updates. And as always, thanks for watching.